What would your granny think about the way we talk about menopause and perimenopause nowadays? Or your great-granny, if you're in your 40s. Did she suffer as she went through perimenopause? Did she have hot flashes? Or did she sail through? Who knows? Because they didn't talk about those things in those days, did they? I lived with my grandmother from birth to the age of 5, and I remember when my aunties got together and my grandmother, my nan, them talking about things that I wasn't supposed to hear. And it would all be in hushed tones, out of earshot of the men. So it would be women's problems, but they were mouthed with exaggerated mouth movements. Or if they had to talk about it, they might talk about down below, pointing downwards, but nowhere near one's nether regions. It was all accepted, wasn't it, as part of a long-suffering women's lot. I mean, people in those days did tend to suffer in silence if they were ill anyway. So we didn't really know. The next generation coming up, our mothers' generations, weren't given any guidance or even knew about it. I mean, they didn't even know about sex, did they, until they were married. They weren't given guidance by their mothers, unless it was, lie back and think of England, darling, it'll soon be over. One thing's for sure. My nan never got hormone replacement therapy. And she didn't change her diet or her exercise either. But then they ate differently in those days, didn't they? There were no processed foods, no convenience foods, except maybe the occasional fish and chip supper. Everything was cooked from scratch. And everything was local or locally sourced, sometimes even from your own garden. So eggs from the chicken coop at the end of the garden. That was my job every morning, to go down and put my hand underneath the chickens to see if they'd laid their eggs. There was one particularly nasty chicken that's haunted my dreams ever since, who never wanted me to look to see if she'd laid an egg and would peck at my little hands. But apart from that, there was something really lovely about having the eggs from the chickens. And my nan taught me to say thank you to each one who gave up her eggs willingly for our boiled egg and toast soldiers. The vegetables, as I say, would come from the garden or maybe from the allotment. A lot of my uncles had allotments. For anyone who's not in the UK, an allotment would be a communal area where people hired strips of land to grow their fruit, vegetables and flowers. I had an uncle who used to grow sweet peas because they were his wife's favourite. But mainly it was vegetables. Flowers were considered a little bit of a waste of space. Meat came from the local butcher who sourced his meat from the local farms. They'd get vegetables that didn't come from the garden, from the greengrocer, and fruits. I remember those little brown paper bags. I used to love watching them put the food in the paper bags, the tomatoes or whatever, and then they would spin them so that there was like a little seal on the top of the paper bag. I'm making it sound like the good old days. They were just happy memories for my nan. I wouldn't want to go back to a lot of those things. And certainly not the silence surrounding women's health. They didn't cook with olive oil or coconut oil the way we do now. It was mainly lard and butter. But those saturated fats were offset by the fresh, unadulterated green vegetables, the green leafy veg and so on that they ate. The phytonutrients that they didn't know were phytonutrients, they just knew they were good for us. So Granny's diet was in fact very close to what we're advised to eat now. Maybe that helped ameliorate some of the symptoms. I don't know about your nan. Let me know in the comments. But mine certainly didn't belong to a gym. In fact, exercise was considered the domain of athletes and eccentrics. I had an aunt who would skip rope every morning, and she was considered to be a little bit tapped because of that. There was the Women's Health and Beauty League, which was started in the 1930s between the wars, which was the first sort of mass women's exercise programme. And they did have a branch in Hertfordshire, which was where we lived. And I can imagine that my aunt was probably a member of the Women's Health and Beauty League. My nan, though, didn't lack for exercise, not at all. Life was different, wasn't it? So every day, or almost every day at least, we would walk down to the village and we would buy the meat, the vegetables, the bread, if she hadn't made it herself. And then she would carry her heavy basket all the way home from the village. Nice bit of weight training there. She didn't have any trouble lifting things like heavy baskets of washing. Monday was wash day. There were no machines. Clothes were given a good shake and then they were put in hot, sudsy water. Big tongs used to push it up and down and agitate it and swirl it about, and then they were picked up and put into the bucket of clean water where she would agitate them by hand and squeeze and lift and drip until they were clean. Then she would wring them by hand, the strength she must have needed for her hands, and pass them through an old-fashioned mangle. Now, I don't know how many people were using mangles in 1961, but that was certainly the case in our house. And then she would lug out that basket and she would hang all the washing up by hand. I think that's where I got my love, from hanging out the washing and watching it blowing in the breeze. It takes me back to a time where I felt safe with my nan and my job was to hand out the pegs. We didn't have fitted carpets and vacuum cleaners. In fact, any carpet in the house was cleaned with a hand-driven carpet sweeper. I think they were made by a company called Bissell. Who remembers those? Tell me in the comments. And then rugs. Rugs were dragged outside and put over the line. Not on a Monday, because the washing was on the line on a Monday. They were put over the line every week and then beaten with a carpet beater. Do you remember those things that were that shaped, trefoil shaped, to beat the carpets and then dragged back in again? Women those days certainly weren't short of exercise. I don't really ever remember my grandmother being still, except maybe sitting with a cup of tea when all the chores were done, before it was time to start cooking. We're told nowadays, aren't we, to get up and move around, to not sit for too long. And I don't think women those days would ever have needed to be given that advice. They were constantly on the go. Maybe that too helped with perimenopausal symptoms. But none of that means that women didn't suffer. They probably just weren't given a reason for it. They talked about the change. Again, just mouthed, the change. It was a stage in life, a stage when women often went a bit doolally. I remember that term being used. Oh, it's her age. She's going through the change. You know, the rage. She's going through the change. Her poor husband. She's going through the change. The lack of energy. The psychological effects of perimenopause that we sometimes get, such as anxiety and depression and mood swings and so on. It wasn't long since doctors were prescribing things for hysteria. Women were regarded as being hysterical. And it was probably simply that they were going through the perimenopause. So when I look back, I do feel so sorry for those women, the ones that did suffer. I wonder how much support they gave each other. I wonder if they talked about it amongst themselves when there weren't little ears listening. Certainly not when there were men listening. Even looking after yourself wasn't really something that women concerned themselves with. They barely had the time, did they? Everything was so manual in those days. Vanity was definitely something that was frowned upon. I have this photograph here of both my grandmothers at my parents' wedding. I'll put this so that you can see it more clearly, but this is the nun that I stayed with, Dorothy. She was 59 there. And this lovely lady here was my maternal grandmother, Kath. She would have been about 48. It's amazing, isn't it? When you look at those women and you realise they went from being young mothers to grandmothers overnight. They didn't have this amazing stage that we have now, where we start to have an empty nest, or we start to slow down a bit at work maybe, or we carve out time around our busy lives to look after ourselves. We run, we exercise in other ways. We go to our yoga classes, we go for a facial, or to have our hair done. I mean, hair dye was around then, wasn't it? But it wasn't as subtle as it is now. I remember one person that we knew had really black hair, and my nan used to say, "Who does she think she's fooling?" Oh, that just came to me. I remember that. Who does she think she's fooling? Bless her. She was fooling herself. She just wanted to feel, she didn't want to go from mother to grandmother straight away. Maybe she wanted that bit in the middle. And then, of course, there's the blue and the pink rinse. That was the acceptable hair colour for anyone with grey hair. We've come a long way. We have so many more choices, don't we? And luckily, we also have choices when it comes to our menopause care and our health. We can affect it so profoundly by changing our diet, by exercising. Things that our grandmothers knew without even knowing that they knew them. Because of the way we live now, we don't suffer inconvenience. Everything's automated. Everything has a machine to help us with it. We have different stresses nowadays. Not saying they didn't have stress in those days. My goodness, they lived through the Second World War, if not the first as well. You know, they knew what stress was. The welfare state was new. They knew what it was to not be able to afford a doctor or, you know, to afford medicine for your children. But their stresses are different. The stresses that we experience now are more low-key but constant. Social media, emails, being expected to do more and more and more, constantly rushing. That kind of stress builds up in the system and doesn't help with our perimenopause symptoms. So, what would your granny say about us talking about this on here? What would she say about us talking about vaginas and sex and our bodies generally? It's a different world we live in now, isn't it? And I think, for all the nostalgia, it's definitely a much better one. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm Jo. Try again. I've not been Jo Blackwell. I am Jo Blackwell. Thank you for joining me. Do hit the like button if you've enjoyed this. Do subscribe if you'd like to hear more. See you next time.